So our topic is materialism. How does it affect our understanding of origins? You look up the definition, it's fairly simple. The belief that only matter and physical laws exist. Everything else can be explained by them. So what we can see, that's what exists. Nothing else. And of course, it's one of the prominent views in philosophy these days. And some of us, Bible believers, wonder what to do with this. Okay, is it? Can we modify it a little and use it, make use of it? Well, we need to know what it really means. If matter and physical laws are all that exist. Okay, we can think about what does that say about light? What does it say about fields like biology or like geology? For life, well, I understood a little better the implications of materialism. I was talking to a good friend, a geologist, who thinks very materialistically. And we were talking about the time, geological time. And he was pointing out that sand and clay form by the breakdown of granitic rocks. Okay, there's just an unbelievable amount of sandstone out there. It's just, you travel in the western United States, and it's just unimaginable how much sand there is in the rocks. And he pointed out all this sand. He says it takes, of course, millions of years to break down this granitic rock to make sand and clay. And so, you got to have all that time. I asked him, well, what if at creation time, as God was preparing the earth with soil for growing things, and what if he needed a lot of sand and a lot of clay? His response, well, now you're talking about a miracle, which to him is simply not acceptable. Any kind of miracle is not acceptable. And so, there's another option, of course, and that is many of us think that the earth and universe was here long before our creation week. So if that's true, maybe God could just let natural processes go and make a lot of sand and a lot of clay. Well, that's a possibility, but you still have to arrange that the way it should be for good soil. That doesn't happen by itself. So no matter what, you're talking about a miracle. Okay, so materialism, a true materialist simply cannot accept a miracle. So what does that say about life? Well, there was no Jesus, there was no resurrection, so basically no hope if materialism is really true. So materialism isn't something you can modify a little and fit it with our understanding. It's a totally opposite point of view. And it carries a whole lot of implications even beyond the obvious ones. So in biology, understanding biology, how biology came to be, from a materialistic point of view, there's no creator, no creation, no miracles ever. And so it requires that life came about by materialistic process and evolution, random mutation, and natural selection. And just to use one example, and I'm not a biochemist, but I can tell you enough about a couple of examples. Every one of our cells in our body has ATP synthase. It's a little machine, little protein machine that makes ATP. And of course, without ATP, no cell is alive. So we have millions of these little ATP synthase in every one of our cells in our body. And what is ATP synthase? Well, it's like a little motor, for one thing. It's spinning, and it's squeezing things together and moving chemicals around, forcing things together, kicking out ATPs, which provide the energy for all life processes. I read an article by Michael Behe, about ATP synthase, and he actually went through what all had to be invented before we could understand ATP synthase. The different kinds of microscopes, different kinds of things. It's a very long, complicated process. What you need to do to be able to see ATP synthase. And he was listening to a lecture by a man who probably knows more about any of this than anybody else. And so talk about this ATP synthase and what it does. So this little machine, amazing machine, is spinning 7,800 RPMs, kicking out ATPs. There are millions of those in every living cell. So how'd that happen? Anyway, this guy's lecture, somebody at the end asked him, how did that evolve? And his answer was, well, it evolved very slowly as some unknown intermediate. That's all he had to say. He probably knows more about it than anybody else in the world. That's all he could say. And so he said under his breath, he mumbled 2 words, game over.
I think Tim asked the same guy, is there any way that this is this reducible in any way? And he said no.
But if you believe in materialism, you have no choice. Just think about our hands. I mean, I talked about this with my friend, my geologist friend. Our hands are a miracle. I mean, they what can your hand do? It can learn to be expert on a violin, on a piano. Okay, how much of that was needed to survive evolutionary natural selection? We don't need that, you know, to survive. Humans and all other animals, in terms of materialism, are the result of natural selection with the sole object of maximizing reproduction. Natural selection can't identify anything else except how much did this creature reproduce. That's all it can determine. Okay, how much of a detailed hand do you need to survive, to escape from a lion or whatever you need? Philosopher Alvin Plantinga wrote some interesting things about this. He faced it very frankly. He actually is understood as being, he's a Christian, as being sort of single-handedly destroyed some of the arguments for evolution. And he makes the point, okay, how much do you need to know about truth to escape from a lie? Well, actually, maybe ideas that are actually false, but they help to fool a lion would be what you need. There's no way that we can think of that having an understanding of truth is important for escaping from a predator. And so, but if you're a materialist, you have no choice. And in geology is what I deal with more. And there are implications here that you would not necessarily expect. And in geology, of course, like other processes, if you're a materialist, there can be no miracles. So I mentioned the sand and clay that has to come from breakdown of granitic rocks for millions of years. Another thing that materialism says is that all processes out there in geology, the processes, the rates, and the time has to be determined by what happens today. All the geologic column has to form by processes that we can see today, or are feasible today. Okay, where do the sediments come from for making rocks? Well, they can be carried by rivers, flash floods, those kind of processes. That's what produces. That's what produces the rocks that we see. And so you need to study those processes as they happen today. There can't be any seriously catastrophic processes forming the rocks. Well, why not? I mean, well, because your assumptions say that's true. You can't, there are all these millions of years, if you accept materialism, you have to occupy. And so, you know, if these rocks form very rapidly, what are you going to do? You just have to stick a lot of time in between. But it has implications, again, like that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I study certain kinds of rocks, cross-bedded sandstones, coconina sandstone, Navajo sandstone. If you got in the desert and you got in a windstorm, the wind is carrying the sand and it's depositing in little laminations, layers on the fronts of sand dunes. Okay, and that, in cross-bedded sandstones are like that. You have these layers, fine layers of sand, you know, hundreds of them, and then you have a flat layer, and then hundreds more. And well, water does the same thing to sand as air does. There's cross-bedded sand dunes, essentially cross-bedded sandstones forming underwater in the ocean. I don't know if there's any of those that are actually rock yet, but to most geologists, these sandstones that I study cannot be made underwater. Okay, why not? And I don't see any real geological reason why they could not be formed by water. But it doesn't fit the model, the materialistic model. You need all this time to occupy deserts as we see them. Take thousands of years to form all these layers. If you form underwater, you could do it much faster, but that doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the worldview. It has to be fast. And I run into this all the time in trying to publish papers. If I'm not too careful how I say things, and it looks like I'm questioning that model, paper just gets shot down. So it has a lot of implications. There has to be, in their model, it cannot be a time scale anything like we think about it, as Bible believers. It has to be radically different. And you know, a lot of rocks, you study those rocks, you look at them, you look for evidence of a long time. And it may not be any there, really. But the materialistic model requires that they be formed very, very slowly. So there has to be all this time. And one interesting thing is, even if those rocks, there are many things that may help us, lead us to believe that those rocks were formed very fast, catastrophic. But if you look at it with the eyes of a materialist, you don't see that. You see things happening a certain way. I collaborated in research in Wyoming with a geologist who was an atheist, and we look at this rock, and he would just see, like, this is a delta, and this is. You have to. You see that if that's what you're looking for. Otherwise, there's no reason to think it's that way at all.
If the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
That's right. You gotta hit it. There's an area in Utah that I've been very interested in. Since I do a lot of travel through the area, I observed what's called the Grand Staircase. Some of you have been there, I'm sure. You're familiar with what the Grand Staircase is? Anyway, you go up, you drive north through Arizona. Well, even while you're in Arizona, there are rock layers, one above the other. And then you go up into Utah, and there are more rock layers, one above the other. But they don't go all the way down, south. I guess I can write it for you. here's the Grand Canyon. And there's a okay, here's all the rock layers of the Grand Canyon. You go north a little ways, and there's a cliff called the Chocolate Cliff. And you go north, and there's another cliff, the Vermilion Cliff. You go north, there's another cliff, the White Cliffs, and then there's the Pink Cliffs. Okay, anyway, each of these are rock formations. And these geologists believe that all of these layers once came all the way down into Arizona, but they've been washed away. And so the standard set of grand staircase starts here, goes up to here. Actually, it keeps on going up into northern Utah, but so why is it that these rock layers end? Each series of rock formations end in a cliff. And it actually doesn't stop here. It continues on into Arizona down to something called the Mogollon Rim. Okay, why would these stop each at a cliff like this? And they don't just kind of gradually fade out as you go south. It's a cliff, a dramatic cliff. And the geological time from here up to the top could be, I'm not sure how, probably a couple 100 million years. And so you ask, how did this form? Why does it form these cliffs? And the usual answer will be, what we see today is what happens, is what has formed these. So in Yosemite National Park, in the recent decade or two, there have been several rock falls. Each case it killed one or two hikers up there. So you get a slab of rock falling. All right, if this process goes on for millions of years, once in a while you have a rock fall, and that's the way they would interpret this. One rock fall at a time, over many millions of years, it does this. I looked for geological literature to help me to understand why it's like this.
We should find a lot of dead hikers.
Yeah, you should. Or at the very least, you ought to find a lot of rock debris.
Yeah.
And you don't.
What is symmetry?
And so, one rock fall at a time over millions of years. Well, I found one article that talks about this grand staircase. They don't seem to really ask, how did you form the grand staircase? This one article, it concluded that these cliffs or scarps move back about a kilometer for 1 to 9 million years. That was his conclusion. Okay, how did he reach that conclusion? There are two assumptions that are not stated in the paper, but it's not hard to figure out what they are. One is he's assuming this formed over hundreds of millions of years, one rock fall at a time. He's assuming that. Doesn't talk about it. Just assumes it, obviously. And then he also assumes that the radiometric time scale is correct. And he used that to calibrate to get his 1 to 9 million years. That doesn't really address the issue. Why these remain as cliffs, prominent cliffs. I see I've got a whole article on this in the journal Origins. You can look it up, you can study it. If you, again, one rock fall at a time, and erosion by rivers as it occurs today. And I've mapped this to try to see what I would expect if that's the way it formed, and it just doesn't fit at all. And as I see it, there's only one way to explain this, and that is you have massive catastrophic erosion, which starts up here. And the water is flowing this way on a huge, enormous scale, and it's cutting these out. And it does what is called headward erosion. When you have water flow, high level water flow coming, it'll start eroding, not from here, erode back farther and farther. And the interesting is, you look at what a river does. It carves a canyon or a broad plain, and there's a riverbank on each side of the river. Rivers don't erode from one direction, and that's it. They erode, they leave a riverbank on each side. Okay, this is the northern bank. Where's the southern bank? It goes down here, it drops down. I find it very interesting to observe central and southern Arizona. These are, if you're familiar with the geologic column, these are Precambrian. This is the oldest point in which you find fossils. Precambrian. Okay, that drops down here, and now in southern Arizona, it's flat. It's just amazingly flat with volcanic rocks sticking out. Okay, so where's the southern bank? There is nothing. So how do you do that? Yeah.
So, I guess that's your west and this is your east, right? From west to
Well,
east.
it's more north to south.
Oh, north to south. So, do we find those sediments deposit? Where do we find those sediments deposit?
Where?
Yeah, I guess in this direction, right?
Okay, this is central Arizona. This is northern Utah. And from there it goes on up into Wyoming.
So, do you find on the other side those sediments that were eroded, deposited somewhere?
They're apparently in the ocean. So that you got the Colorado River coming from Wyoming and Colorado, coming down through all of this, down to here and out into the ocean. Okay, and it looks like that all this just unimaginable volume of sediment is gone into the ocean. And so this requires, it looks to me like, a process that doesn't happen today, except we can duplicate it in Monty's flume. It's very interesting. I don't know if you know about his flume. Flume is like a long aquarium with water flowing through. There's sediment in it. Depending on how you manage it, you can make layers of rock. And then if you open up the end and let the water run down, it does exactly this.
Wow.
Cuts a series of these cliffs. And so that's how I can see the Grand Case staircase being formed. I don't see any other way that it can be formed. And nobody's asking that question in the geological community. They're just not asking. It isn't.
This would be really solid evidence for the flood.
To me, it is. Solid evidence for somebody who's open to thinking that way. If you're asking, will it convince a materialist? No. I mean, they've decided what's what. Yeah.
What's the span on the horizontal level about these cliffs? How are we talking about? Like 100 feet, miles,
For the whole thing,
on a horizontal plane?
well, from here to here would be, what, several hundred miles.
No, I mean the other way. So not this
Oh,
way.
This way?
Yeah.
Well, it's all across Utah, and the geology changes as you get to the west, but it's across Arizona, it's what, 100, 200 miles, I think, roughly.
It's pretty uniform all the way across.
Yeah, you mean, I've studied, a colleague and I have done research on one of these cliffs, and we followed it all the way across Arizona. The only way to study it, what we're doing, is with a helicopter, so we've flown these cliffs all the way across Arizona. It's just very extensive.
Do they have a name, or the cliffs?
Pardon?
Is there a name for the cliff formation?
Yeah, well, there, over here is the Mogollon Rim. This is the Chocolate Cliffs, Vermilion Cliffs, White Cliffs.
The
Oh,
grand,
also one name for each. Yes.
Pardon?
There's one name for each segment.
Yeah,
Mm.
well, the southern, the main part of this formation, that's typically identified as the Grand Staircase. They're all named, and you can look at a map of Arizona, and you've got them, if it has this kind of detail, they'll be named. And of course, the layers, an individual rock formation doesn't go forever. You'll go from east to west for maybe a couple hundred miles, and may fade into another formation. And so it just continues on. But this Grand Staircase thing is kind of a unique thing in Utah. It's wonderful. So if we do not follow materialism, what happens to us as a scientist? Well, I've been told many times, and heard it said many times, that if you're going to believe in the Bible and miracles, you can't work as a scientist. No, I find it exactly the opposite. People who study this, they're not asking, how did this happen? It's their assumptions tell them how it had to happen. No, I can look at it and I can just simply ask, okay, how did this happen? What happened here, and how long did it take? And I can be thinking about a variety of different options, and I can look at ways to test between those. Whereas they're not doing that. And so I have a distinct advantage in my research, and I could detail that with very specific examples of how it opens our mind to ask questions, to think of things that others simply don't ask and don't think of. We did research in Peru, down where Maria comes from, on fossil whales. Thousands of fossil whales, beautifully preserved whales. When we got there, we saw these whales, and we did a bit of checking in the literature, and they were in sandstone and diatomite. And it was understood, these have been studied for decades, it was understood that the sediment that covers them, the diatomite, accumulates about this much per 1,000 years. Because that's the way it happens in the ocean today. It accumulates that much per 1,000 years. Okay, and there have been people who studied these whales all that time. But it was always understood, that much per 1,000 years. Well, we looked at that, and a problem struck us in the face immediately. How do you, if you bury a whale this much per 1,000 years, how long is that whale going to last? And it's known from research done right off here on California. When a whale dies, the scavengers attack by the thousands, and the tissue is gone within 6 months. The bones then start to be worked on, and they're gone in a few years. Everything's gone in a few years. How could a whale sit there for 10,000 years and be beautifully preserved, an articulated skeleton? Why had nobody asked this question? Because of assumptions. Nobody had asked the question because they thought they knew how long it took. Well, we immediately saw a problem. It can't be. And we started collecting data, and when we had our data together, we then presented a paper, and I submitted a paper for publication, that the whales, to preserve those whales, requires rapid accumulation of sediments. And Raul, I don't know if you know Raul Esprante, he was my graduate student who worked on this. And we presented a paper at a taphonomy congress in Spain. And due to some confusion in the way they ran things, we didn't know how big our posters could be. And so anyway, the posters were supposed to be 1 meter square. Well, we came down with 2 posters about 7 meters long, 7 feet long. And so Raul wrote them out, and rolled them out, and then the guys in charge said, "Oh, we'll put those up." So we had a special place with more room, where we had 2 of these posters, and all the others had their little. And there were an hour, 2 sessions of an hour and a half each for people to look at the posters. They said, you leave yours up the whole time. So the first hour and a half, there were a lot of people milling around our posters, and then they went off to the others. Then two people came that we were hoping we could talk to. Anna K. Behrensmeyer and Susan Kidwell. Those are 2 of the world's top taphonomists. So they came down there, and we ended up with an hour and a half with Kidwell and Behrensmeyer. And they, when they saw the data, they said, well, it's obvious, you're right. They have to be buried very quickly. And Behrensmeyer was one of the reviewers on my paper. So if you get your data together, and if it's written up carefully so they don't get too scared, what your implication is, they recognize it.
I see.
And there's no question, it was easier for them to recognize what the truth was. Since we finished, there's another group have gone down to study the same whales. It's a group of Europeans, Italians with a few others. And we finally gave up there because they've got 30 people in their group, and here are 2 of us. I mean, we can't compete with them. But they wrote a paper on the whales, same subject that we were studying in the same whales. They actually used a whole set of our data within their paper. But they obviously were very uncomfortable with our idea that you have to bury these quickly. And so they came up with 3 different ways to preserve the whales.
Mm.
None of which, as far as I can see, can work.
Mm.
One is they're saying, well, the water was at least low in oxygen, so that reduces decay. Well, you see this often in the literature in geology.
Almost.
Low oxygen, so no decay. Well, in the 1970s, there was a series of experiments done to test that idea, and it always failed. You put animals like shrimp or some other soft-bodied creature, you put it in water with oxygen, water with no oxygen, it doesn't reduce decay, it doesn't even slow it down. The reason is not hard to figure out, because when you die, the bacteria that cause the decay are coming mostly from inside the body. And those are anaerobic bacteria, they don't need oxygen. So low oxygen doesn't prevent decay. The other problem is, one of my graduate students studied the sediments that the whales are in. There's a lot of evidence of massive storm currents. And so the sediment was brought in by storm currents. Lots of agitation. There was no possibility of that being anaerobic. There's plenty of oxygen. So that is not going to work. And then the other thing, they concluded that as the whales settle in the mud, in the sand, the current kind of works around them and it partially buries them. Well, that's true. We've seen that in our whales. They've been kind of worked down into the sediment, so they're at least partially covered. Okay, what's going to happen if that happens? Well, the part that's buried will be protected a little more. The part that's exposed is going to be decayed rapidly. In fact, you should see the difference from one side of the skeleton to the other. Well, there's no difference. So that's not going to work. I don't even remember what the third thing was, but
If you have anaerobic water, then wouldn't any kind of smaller prey just die? Like fish need to breathe through water, so if you have low oxygen content in the water, then they would just die anyway, wouldn't they?
yeah, sure. And actually, no oxygen. There's plenty of oxygen. So that is not going to work. And then the other thing, they concluded that as the whales settle in the mud, in the sand, the current kind of works around them and it partially buries them. Well, that's true. We've seen that in our whales. They've been kind of worked down into the sediment, so they're at least partially covered. Okay, what's going to happen if that happens? Well, the part that's buried will be protected a little more. The part that's exposed is going to be decayed rapidly. In fact, you should see the difference from one side of the skeleton to the other. Well, there's no difference. So that's not going to work. I don't even remember what the third thing was, but
If you have anaerobic water, then wouldn't any kind of smaller prey just die? Like fish need to breathe through water, so if you have low oxygen content in the water, then they would just die anyway, wouldn't
Yeah, sure. And actually, no oxygen, it does keep out most of the scavengers. They're gonna eat the flesh. Doesn't, bacteria don't worry about it. So they'll do the job.
But why would the whales be in that area if there's no prey?
Well, okay, the whole thing is a fairly catastrophic situation, it looks
Oh.
like. This is right on the coast of Peru, the west coast. The Andes are right here. At the time the whales were there, the Andes are coming up. So there's just a massive amount of volcanic ash. Volcanic ash has a little glass shards. Breathing that's not a good idea. So that will kill the whales. Also, there was this enormous amount of diatoms. And we had somebody study our diatoms, and they were not from shallow water. They were coming from offshore. So you had like red tides, enormous amount of red tides with all these diatoms, which produce toxin. So the toxin, the whales were apparently coming for the food source there, but they were being killed by the toxins and by the ash. And so they got killed and washed into the shallow bays.
Were you able to rebuttal any of their arguments?
Well, I didn't worry about their arguments. I mean, I didn't, this paper that came after us, that made those arguments,
Right, have you been able to rebuttal that?
I didn't bother to try. You won't get anywhere.
All right.
But their theory will be accepted because it fits.
You want to,
It fits their
It fits their
scientific,
worldview.
materialistic
Right.
worldview.
And so others will not ask, will not inquire. And I find often that's the case. The arguments that are being made for long ages, they don't get addressed by anybody. And they're not necessarily good arguments. But that just shows the way people think, the way they work, depends on your philosophy, on your assumptions that you start with. It's all about assumptions. In many of these areas, assumptions rule in science. And it's not understood by people who accept those assumptions.